On March 6 of 1900, on the corner of Clay and Stockton in San Francisco's Chinatown, 41-year-old Wong Chut-king was found dead. His corpse was covered in dark marks called buboes, the classic sign of bubonic plague. His death confirmed the fears that local public health officials had for months. For the first time in the country's history, the bubonic plague had finally come to the United States. Over the next few years, plague would be found as far east as New Mexico and Colorado, but for the most part, San Francisco contained the spread of disease and prevented what would have been a nationwide public health crisis. But not because the people in charge knew what they were doing. The initial response was explicitly motivated by prejudice, then it was covered up by the media and corrupt politicians. It was a bit of a public health disaster, which is what makes this such a fascinating story.
I live right next to San Francisco, so today I'm going to take you into the city to show you how San Francisco bungled the plague. But before we do that, we need to rewind, because before the tech bros took over, this city looked way different.
In the middle of the 19th century, San Francisco was the fastest growing city on the West Coast. Thanks to the gold rush of 1849, the city's population exploded from 812 in 1848 to 25,000 in 1850. Shortly after that, railroad jobs led to an influx of Chinese American residents. By 1880, 16% of San Francisco residents were Chinese American, most of whom crammed into Chinatown, the poorest and most crowded neighborhood in the city. And thanks to the popular miasma theory of disease, plus, 19th century racism, Chinatown earned a reputation as the epicenter of disease in the city. Case in point, this cartoon printed in a San Francisco newspaper where disease is seen emanating from Chinatown and haunting the city. That cartoon was published in 1882, the year of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first time the US ever passed a law that prevented people from a specific country from coming into the States. In short, the city was getting bigger, and racism against Chinese people was at an all-time high.
San Francisco also hosted the most active international port on the west coast of the US. But with international trade comes exposure to all kinds of diseases. And public health officials knew that if something were to get in through San Francisco, it could easily spread throughout the rest of the United States thanks to the newly constructed railroads. So, San Francisco set up a quarantine station here at Angel Island. Ships would have to stop here before unloading cargo, people, or pathogens into the densely populated city. But this led to political arguments about who would have the authority to declare quarantine in the first place. And in the end, that authority went to the Marine Hospital Service, or MHS, what later became the US Public Health Service.
In the 1890s, a bubonic plague epidemic started moving through Eastern Asia, and by December of 1899, a case of plague had been reported in Honolulu, one of the stopover ports between China and San Francisco. The US Surgeon General, Walter Wyman, was keeping a close eye on the situation and planning his response if the plague ever hit mainland America. One of his strategies involved sending an up-and-coming physician named Joseph Kenyon to oversee the quarantine station at Angel Island, and almost immediately after Kenyon moved out west, a ship named the Nippon Maru came into San Francisco Bay waving yellow flags, the universal sign for disease on board. According to Kenyon's initial report, the crew said that 2 men died of plague at sea, but the crew threw them overboard somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, so Kenyon let them through. But shortly afterwards, 2 bodies wearing Nippon Maru life preservers were found washed ashore in the bay. It was suspected that they were the aforementioned plague victims, but it was never confirmed.
Over the next 2 weeks, San Francisco would have 2 more scares like the Nippon Maru, but Kenyon could never find any active cases of plague on board the ships. Regardless, by winter of 1900, rumors were circulating that plague had somehow gotten into San Francisco, and in March, Wong Chut-king's death confirmed everyone's worst fears. And that's when this story gets just buck wild racist.
San Francisco mayor and white supremacist James Phelan was quoted as saying, "I desire to say that they are fortunate, with the unclean habits of their coolies and their filthy hovels, to be permitted to remain within the corporate limits of any American city. And in a sanitary sense, they are a constant menace to the public health." He wasn't the only prejudiced one in charge. Surgeon General Wyman thought that eating so much rice made Asians more susceptible to plague, while white people were protected by a meat-based diet. Basically, plague was an Asian problem. On March 7th, the day after Wong's death, health inspectors quarantined all of Chinatown, literally surrounding the neighborhood with rope and police officers. But you don't stop germs with a rope, you only stop people. And the message was clear, this quarantine was about separating Chinese people from white people. Fortunately, an organization of local Chinese-owned businesses pushed back and the quarantine was lifted after 2.5 days. But even after formal quarantine, the Board of Health inspected every home in Chinatown and went as far as burning down buildings if they suspected plague. Now, naturally, this kind of explicit racism caused a massive amount of distrust in the health authorities, which caused families in Chinatown to hide people that had become infected with the plague. So the Board of Health resorted to a big hygiene campaign. They cleaned up trash, fumigated houses and sewers with sulfur dioxide, and disinfected the outside of houses with lye or bichloride of mercury. And for a little while, it seemed like it was working. But between May 11th and May 13th, 4 new cases were reported. This got Wyman's attention, who told Kenyon to use something called the half-kind serum, a recently created vaccine against Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague. And while it reduced the chance of infection by 50%, it had some bad side effects. But it was the only pharmaceutical treatment they had at the time. Now, the Chinese community was firmly against it. They worried that the government was either experimenting on them or intentionally trying to poison them. And after multiple days of 0 voluntary vaccinations, Kenyon tried to convince high-profile white people to get vaccinated to show that it was safe. Unfortunately, he couldn't find any white volunteers, and the vaccination campaign failed. By the end of May 1900, they'd found 11 cases of plague in Chinatown, so Kenyon got support from the Board of Health to declare an epidemic and implement a California-wide quarantine. But of course, politics got in the way. Word was starting to spread that plague was in San Francisco, which caused states like Texas and Louisiana to threaten to close their borders to trade and travel from California. This made California's governor, Henry Gage, none too happy. In order to protect his economy and his investments in the Southern Pacific Railroad Company, the governor accused Kenyon of making up the plague to get more funding. He even wrote letters to newspapers and influential people where he denied that the plague existed. He called the whole ordeal a plague fake and threatened anyone who repeated the lie. Eventually, he admitted that there was plague in San Francisco, but he still accused Kenyon of importing the bacteria and planting it in cadavers.
By January of 1901, the situation wasn't getting any better, so the Surgeon General sent federal investigators to San Francisco to figure out what was happening. They were looking for active cases of plague, not corpses. The problem with that is that plague usually kills its victims within 3 to 5 days, so they would need to find and identify bodies quickly.
They confirmed that plague was still infecting residents of San Francisco, and they planned on reporting their findings, but Governor Gage got ahead of them by implementing a statewide news blackout. Now, eventually, the governor and investigators reached a compromise where the Surgeon General would fire Kenyon, California would perform a big hygiene campaign, and the commission wouldn't publish the story. But in late 1902, reporters from the Associated Press and the Sacramento Bee got a hold of the story and leaked how officials had tried to keep the whole thing hidden from the public the whole time. This destroyed the little trust in public health that still existed. The federal government, especially the Surgeon General, had allowed trade and travel to continue despite knowing that plague was in California. And after the news got out, multiple states decided to put their own quarantine on Californian goods and travelers. But pause. This scandal unfolded from the beginning of 1901 and ended in 1903 when Governor Gage lost re-election. Meanwhile, Kenyon had been kicked out of his position and the MHS still needed a new leader. He was replaced by a doctor named Rupert Blue, and he was the first person in the MHS to try to actually connect with Chinese San Franciscans. One of his first moves was setting up a morgue in Chinatown itself in that alley, right next to Portsmouth Square here. One day in early July, Blue got a call that a few prostitutes at a local brothel had developed those classic buboes, so he and his men went down and collected blood samples and performed something called an agglutination test, a technology that had only recently been developed in India. This blood test suggested that they did have plague, and when they died a few days later, autopsies of the buboes confirmed that, but after them, Blue wouldn't find another plague victim for months, which meant the plague was either going away, or more likely, nobody was reporting plague deaths. So he decided to change strategies. He hired a man named Wang Chung as an interpreter, a man who had previously worked for that same organization of Chinese companies that had gotten rid of the quarantine. This ended up being a good move. Wang taught Blue about Chinese culture, and after a while, he started trusting Blue's intentions and brought him more plague cases. By September, 42 cases of plague had been reported in San Francisco, all of which were in Chinatown. But then 2 white people got the disease. One, a 51-year-old sailor, and the other, a 53-year-old woman. While the sailor's case remained a mystery, Blue pointed out that the woman lived only a few blocks from Chinatown. quote, a distance easily covered by rats in their migration. And that was prophetic because at that point, we still weren't sure how rats were involved in plague. Less than a decade before the epidemic, French researcher Alexander Yersin isolated the plague bacteria and named it Yersinia pestis. Shortly after, another French researcher found that fleas could carry plague from rats to humans, and that newly infected plague victims often had a small insect bite mark. But this transmission theory wasn't accepted right away. Surgeon General Wyman thought that it was more of a correlation than a causation. Fleas and rats are just part of the kinds of filthy environments where you happen to find plague victims. Now, of course, fleas do transmit plague, which was confirmed by more extensive research in 1903, but Blue never got to follow that lead because the city suddenly ended the sanitation and hygiene programs in the winter of 1901. And if San Francisco authorities were seeing this many cases and they were still canceling the program, there was no helping them. So Blue decided to step down and move to Milwaukee. After a quiet winter, the city relaxed a bit, but starting in May of 1902, the city saw multiple new cases of plague every month. And while Blue's replacement asked the Surgeon General for more funding, he turned them down, hoping the whole thing would just go away on its own. After months of no progress, Wyman knew that to get rid of the plague, he'd have to somehow restore trust in public health officials. And to do that, he needed to hire back Rupert Blue, which he did in 1903. This time, Blue decided he was going to follow the lead on rats and started two massive campaigns. One, improve sanitation in Chinatown, and two, for the first time in American history, control plague with rat proofing. This involved thousands of dissections, and my favorite public health thing ever, mousetraps with arsenic-laced cheese. Blue also shifted prevention responsibility to landlords and ordered them to put a layer of concrete on the ground floor so that rats couldn't climb through. All in all, the team oversaw 22 blocks of newly concreted floors and walls throughout the city. Blue also negotiated it so that he'd have funding until San Francisco was plague-free.
And it seemed to work. The last case of plague associated with this outbreak was reported on February 29th of 1904. There were a couple cases that popped up in Contra Costa County that were worrisome, but by 1905, city officials were ready to celebrate eradication. All in all, they had calculated 121 cases of bubonic plague and 118 deaths. San Francisco eased up on their cleanup campaign, and the Surgeon General sent Blue back to Virginia. And everyone was healthy forever. No, I'm kidding. There's even more death.
On April 18th, 1906, a massive 7.9 earthquake hit San Francisco. 80% of the city's buildings were destroyed through the quake and resulting fires. The damage took years to clean up and rebuild from, but in the immediate aftermath, 3,000 people died and 250,000 people would become displaced or homeless. This led to an awful sanitation situation. Thousands of people lived in crowded tent cities and shared open toilets dug into the ground, which is a perfect recipe for cholera and typhoid. One day, an Italian teenager across the bay in Oakland started showing some strange sores on his legs, which turned out to be buboes. And by May 1907, a few men presented to the USM hospital with buboes too. Plague was back. And while we weren't quite in the middle of another epidemic, Blue came back from Virginia to supervise the public health situation. From May 1907 to March of 1908, 89 deaths from plague were reported, and only 8 of them were Chinese. This is when Blue finally had his light bulb moment. The only thing that mattered was controlling rats. A study had just come out from the Philippines that showed that if more than 2% of your rat population was infected with the plague, you'd get an epidemic. And at that point, 1.5% of San Francisco's rats had the plague. So Blue wouldn't just have to control rats, he'd have to wipe them off the face of the city, scorched earth style. He started by sending rat catchers into the streets, tagging each rat with a location, and then did an autopsy on them. He also continued rat-proofing buildings, which is a great reminder in modern day that housing is a public health issue. In December of 1908, the San Francisco Call printed a letter that he wrote to the mayor, saying that San Francisco is now one of the cleanest cities in the United States. There has been no case of human plague since January 30th, 1908.
A few years later, antibiotics came out and we'd finally have an effective pharmaceutical strategy against the plague. But in the immediate aftermath of the epidemic, Blue led the transition of the Marine Hospital Service into the new, wider-reaching U.S. Public Health Service. And in 1912, he replaced Wyman as the Surgeon General. And this wouldn't be his last epidemic either. Just 6 years later, he noticed more and more reports of a violent version of influenza spreading throughout army camps. But that's a story for another time.